Okay. Well then today let's start our next major figure, Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the basic thinkers of the Western tradition. His scientific theories were not superseded for really about 1,500 years. He was an immensely influential figure in physics, in biology, in astronomy, in a variety of other areas. And he is still one of the most important philosophers in the Western tradition. In fact, most Catholic philosophy, most Islamic philosophy, most Jewish philosophy, in fact, most of medieval philosophy in general, is built on a foundation of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle has been so influential partly because his works are extremely deep. You can devote your life to them, and I've often thought, if I were going to a desert island and could take only a few books with me, what would I take? Surely one of them would be a volume of the collected works of Aristotle, because there's just so much going on in it. Every time you read it, you see something new. Well, his ethics are like that. The ethics are dramatically different, although as we'll see, very similar to Confucius, but dramatically different from those of his teacher, Plato, and his teacher, Socrates. Aristotle is doing a lot of new things here. He develops a theory of virtue that is still one of the chief contemporary approaches to ethics. And so Aristotle isn't just important historically. I would say that among American philosophers, for example, or British philosophers, those working in the English tradition, about a quarter of contemporary ethicists think of themselves as Aristotelians in one way or another. So he still exerts immense influence. Well, Aristotle was a philosopher in ancient Athens. Socrates was the one who really began the process of examining philosophical positions and giving philosophical arguments. His student, Plato, was the first person to really start writing all of these down in a systematic way, and so Plato wrote a series of dialogues. Aristotle, according to the tradition, wrote brilliant and beautiful dialogues. However, they're entirely lost. What we have are works that really we're fortunate to have it all. They spent about 100 years in a Turkish basement, but luckily managed to survive. And these works are written very tersely. In fact, some people think they were really his class notes. Something like what appears on my slides. Imagine that hundreds of years from now, the only thing you remember to Buttavac are the slides, and the things on the slides, you know? That's something like what we have in Aristotle's case. So they are very directly written. Almost every line is really important. That means everything is there in not a beautiful literary sense, but nevertheless an important philosophical sense. He starts, if you look at it one way, from this distinction between two kinds of goods. He begins the ethics by saying every action, every art, every inquiry is aimed at some good. But there are two kinds of goods. Some goods are desired for their own sake. Other goods are desired for the sake of something else. So instrumental goods, in particular, are instruments. They are sought for the sake of something else. We think of them as good, but because they bring us something else. Whereas intrinsic goods are desired for their own sake. They are things we want just because they're desirable in themselves. So let's start with the easy case. Think of some examples of instrumental goods, things that are good for the sake of something else. It's not that it's good all by itself. It's good because of what it does or what it brings you. Yeah. Exercise, yeah. You might enjoy exercise for its own sake, but surely there are kinds of exercise that nobody enjoys for its own sake. It's sought for the sake of something else, the sake of health. And so, yeah, what's an example of this? Yeah, what's a really unpleasant form of exercise? Yeah, okay, good. I mean, you might take a walk in the woods or go swimming just for the fun of it, but you're unlikely to think, yeah, I'm going to get an elliptical machine and go for an hour. It's hard. I mean, nobody just thinks, oh, that'd be fun. Well, yes, do that. So, I mean, I like lifting weights, and I sort of enjoy it, but on the other hand, it's not something that I might do if it were just to be sought for its own sake. Certainly there are particular exercises I wouldn't do because they're not fun. They sort of hurt. And so that's something that tells us, yeah, a lot of exercise is really done for the sake of something else, namely health. Other things like that, yeah. Money, good. A father of a friend of mine growing up said, I don't care about money. I just care about the things money can buy. Which is a way of saying he cared about money, but as an instrumental good, for the sake of the things it could bring him. Other things like that. Yeah. Religion. Ooh, that's an interesting one. Religion. You might think religion is something like this because it's desirable for the sake of something else, namely the reward God will give you if you're religious. Now, some people think, oh, that's a really lousy reason to be religious. But you could view it that way. You could think, okay, yeah, why should I, especially, it works especially if we think about a particular religious ritual or practice or something like that. What's the value of it? You might think it's purely to please God. It's not that it's so desirable in its own sake. And so at least a lot of religious practice would look this way, even if you thought religion itself wasn't like that. Other things, yeah?
Could you perhaps say like studying or maybe reading even?
Okay, good, studying. Yes, studying is something that is desired for the sake of the knowledge that it brings you and perhaps the passing of the exam that it brings you and so forth. What about reading? It really depends, right? I find that one of the pleasures but also unfortunate aspects of being a professor, I read a lot, okay? And I like reading, so that's not in itself bad. But it's very rare that I get to read something just for fun. It's almost something I feel that I need to read. So do I just wake up and think, gosh, you know, today it'd just be fun to read Krauss, Lehmann, and Wagendour 1990 on cumulative reasoning and non-tautologics? Not really, right? It's a great article, by the way, but it's the sort of thing I feel like, yeah, I need the knowledge that's in this. I need to grasp what's going on there. I'm doing it for the sake of something else. Now, if I go on vacation and bring a fun book along with me to read, and usually my definition of a fun book, by the way, is the sort of thing that other people would find horrible, torture, and instrumental, but compared to most philosophy that I read, it's like, now I'm just reading a fun book on ethics. Yay. But anyway, that's something that I do for its own sake. So you might say there's reading for pleasure, or reading, you know, it's just fun reading, but then there's a lot of reading you do in college that is sort of, what can I say, forced reading. I sometimes think you're like geese, and we're, you know, preparing you for foie gras, and opening your mouth and stuff again. A lot of things, and a lot of what you end up reading is really for the sake of something else. Yeah. Oh, all right. Now, some philosophers have thought, they've said, look, almost everything is an instrumental good. Why? Because it's all directed at one thing, namely pleasure. And so on that view, you wouldn't really say literally that everything is instrumental, but that there's only one thing desired for its own sake, namely pleasure, and everything else is a means to pleasure. Like I said, reading for pleasure. You say, aha, so that's an instrument for pleasure. Money would be an instrument for getting you food, which gives you pleasure, and blah, blah, blah. And so we will look at some philosophers who say, in the end, it all comes down to pleasure. And that's the one thing that's really intrinsically good. As we'll see, that's not Aristotle's view, but that is a view that we will encounter in this term. So that is a possible option, to say, really, in the end, everything is like the first category, except for pleasure in the second category. Okay, let's think about things other than pleasure that might be desired for their own sakes. Are there other things you might desire for their own sake? Yeah?
Like a grand piano that just sits in the living room.
A grand piano that just sits in the living room. Yeah, it's surprising how many people have pianos and do not play, and it just sits there. I don't really understand this. In fact, I mean, I play piano, and I feel a sense of withdrawal when I'm not near a piano. There are not nearly enough pianos, in my opinion. And I really wish I had one in my office, so I'd probably get very little work done. But anyway, it seems to me that, yeah, why does somebody have a piano when they don't play it? It just sits there. Now, it might be an instrument for something. I mean, maybe it's desirable for the sake of something other than music. Maybe they think it will impress people if they have a grand piano in the living room or something. But it could be that they just value pianos, right? They just think, no, it's a beautiful object. And in fact, a lot of art is like this. It's really desired for its own sake. In fact, there's a slogan, ars gratia artis. Art for the sake of art. Art for its own sake, in other words. You might think beauty is like, we like beautiful things because of what they do for us. Well, no, not really. We just like to be surrounded by beauty. We value beauty for its own sake. And so you might think of the piano as an example of such a beautiful object, or a painting that you have, or you enjoy listening to music. Maybe for the sake of the pleasure it brings you, but maybe you just value it for its own sake. Can you think of other things that might be valued for their own sakes? Yeah? Family. Ah, yes. Family members. You might value your parents, your brothers and sisters, somebody you love, for their own sake, right? You could say, you know, gosh, okay, you're friends with that person. Well, tell me, what do they do for you? What are they good for? And you might think, look, I value my friend. It's not that I value my friend for the sake of anything else in particular. I just value that friend. I value friendship for its own sake, not for the sake of what it gets me. Now, sometimes you might befriend somebody because of what they can get you. It's like, whoa, that person really seems to do well on all these philosophy quizzes. Maybe I should be friends with that person, right? And learn the secret. Or that person has a lot of money. Wow, if I marry them, I'll be well set for life. So you could have that attitude toward a person, but actually we think it's pretty nasty if you view people in a purely instrumental way. We think you better value other people for their own sake. Can you think of anything else you value for its own sake? Yeah?
Foods that we enjoy.
Joy?
No, foods that we enjoy.
Oh, foods, yes, foods that we enjoy. Yeah, exactly. One time, a philosopher actually had a blog and said, what are some things that you value for its own sake, for their own sakes? And my answer was Southside shake. Okay, have I told you about Southside shakes? Okay, they're fantastic. There's this one little ice cream shop in Pittsburgh, now actually run by the son of, well, actually I guess it's still owned by a friend of mine from kindergarten, but his father was the one who started the place. Anyway, there's something there called a Southside shake, because it's on the south side of Pittsburgh, and Pittsburghers say south side. And what it is a milkshake filled half the way up, topped with an ice cream sundae. Okay, you can buy any flavors you want. Chocolate milkshake, peanut butter sundae. It is to die for. And actually, they give it the cholesterol content. However, I certainly don't value it for its nutritive value. It's kind of like, in fact, we tend to go there after eating tons of pizza. And so it's sort of disgusting. It's like, I've already consumed 4,000 calories for the day, so what do we need? A Southside shake. There's not a lot. But it is just marvelous. And if you say, oh, it's just an instrument for the pleasure, I'll say, you don't understand. You don't understand at all. Or my latest food obsession, Manja Pizza's green pig pizza. Smoked pulled pork on top of a pizza with a tomatillo sauce topped with jalapenos and onions and avocado. And it's like everything green. it's lots of cilantro. Awesome. It is like the wildest combination of Mexican food and Italian food you can imagine. It's great. Anyway, yeah, there are lots of things like that. There are favorite foods or just favorite places, favorite things that you value for their own sake. Now, there can be overlap. Because Aristotle says, look, at a given moment, maybe you value something merely as an instrument, or maybe you value it purely for its own sake. But often there are things that we value for both reasons, right? For example, with that shake, I may value for its own sake, but also for the sake of the pleasure it brings me. Similarly with the piano, I might value beautiful things for their own sakes, but also because of what pleasures they bring me. Or maybe I value a friend for his own sake, absolutely, but also in part for the other things. That person makes me laugh, or that person produces insights that make me think, wow, that's impressive. I never thought about that before, or whatever. All the qualities of the friend that I actually value might be connected to some kind of good that friend brings me, and yet, I don't want to say the friend is just an instrumental good. The friend is, in a sense, both valued for his own sake, but also for the sake of other things. So there are lots of things in that middle area. Now, what is a final good? What Aristotle means by a final good is one that is always sought for its own sake, and never for the sake of something else. So it's something that is always valued intrinsically. It's always treated as an intrinsic good. It never is in that overlap of something that is valued both instrumentally and intrinsically. Now, friends and in general other people usually belong in that middle category, the intersection. They're valued both for their own sake and for the sake of something else. And the same thing is true of, lots of other things. Aristotle would say, in fact, virtue is like that. We value a good person for their own sake, but also because virtuous people are nicer to be around and so on. They're good for us in various ways, as well as good for their own sake. But is there anything we just always value for its own sake? If you ask, why this, why that, and so on, the end chain is always at the end. It never is like, oh yeah, and I value that because of something else. Can you think of anything that would be like that? It's just never an instrument. It's always the end thing. Always valued for its own sake. Yeah? Life. What about that? Is life something always valued for its own sake and never for the sake of something else? You're saying no. Why? Oh, good. You can have reasons to stay alive, right? You might be wounded on the battlefield and thinking, I have to stay alive. And yeah, partly, I'm sure you value life for its own sake. But you might also think, but I've got to stay alive because I've got to make it to that thing and press the thing down and blow up the bridge before the Nazis cross. And in that case, you're valuing life for its own sake, but also for the sake of something else. You've got to stay alive long enough to do your mission. And so that would be a case of treating life as an instrument. And there might be times when we do that. In fact, there's something else you might worry about. What about a case where life is so horrible that actually you say, life under these circumstances isn't very good? One thing Aristotle thinks is the things in the final category, one characteristic of them is they should always be good. And life isn't always good. Now, I should say here, it's not obvious to me that the various things he says about these final goods are actually all necessarily true, the same things. So I worry about that criterion of his. I'm not sure that's a good argument to use. In any event, let's put that aside and just say, life seems like the thing that almost always is treated as valuable intrinsically, but maybe sometimes is valued for the sake of something else. What about other canons? Yeah?
Well, as I mentioned before, pleasure.
Okay, pleasure. What about that? Is pleasure always desired for its own sake and never for the sake of something else? Can you think of a pleasure that would be good for something? Yeah, you can probably. Don't mention that. Yeah.
You'd say pleasure for the sake of jealousy? If you see, just like trying to,
All right, good. Yes. Let's say I flirt with some woman at a party. Okay, and yes, it's fun to flirt like this, but I'm actually doing it to make my wife jealous. Well, then you could say, I'm enjoying this, but is the pleasure of just the flirtation something I'm seeking it for its own sake? Not really. It's for the sake of pissing off my wife. Not that I would ever do that, but we're dealing with hypothetical scenarios here. Yeah.
But wouldn't then you get pleasure from pissing off your wife, so it takes back?
Oh, well, good. Yes, those philosophers she had in mind are precisely the ones who would say, but look, why are you trying to upset your wife and get her jealous? Because either you're going to just enjoy her jealousy, or because her jealousy is going to make her do something that you will enjoy. So whatever it is, it's all leading back to pleasure. So yes. Can you think of other,
Can you just within the same realm argue that pleasure for the sake of keeping a marriage happy, or pleasure for the sake of keeping a relationship healthy?
Okay, I mean, the pleasure might be for the sake of keeping the relationship healthy, making yourself and other people happy. So that's a possible way of doing this, or thinking about pleasure. Can you ever think of a case where the pleasure really is strictly an instrument? I mean, it's really not what is being sought. You're using it in order to get something else. Oops. Yeah. No.
Maybe his motivation to keep you like eating healthy or working out, or telling yourself this is good.
Yeah, all right, good. That's exactly the kind of thing I had in mind. Let's say you realize you should go to the gym and exercise, but you hate doing it. And so you think, well, in order to keep myself motivated, I'm going to give myself a reward for doing it, right? So, okay, I will go and work out, and I mean, I mentioned I enjoy lifting weights. I hate aerobic exercise. I mean, it's just the most boring thing in the world. It drives me crazy. And so, but I might say, well, listen, if you do that, if you spend, at least 15 minutes on the stationary bicycle or whatever, then you get to have a big glass of chocolate milk when you get home. It's like, okay. Or, maybe I have to take this medicine, and it tastes terrible, but I need to take the medicine. But I'd say, well, all right, I'll do it, but afterwards, I'll give myself a lollipop or something, right? Or you could say methadone is like this, right? You're trying to get somebody off heroin, and you give them a drug that is going to give them some of the effects, but without some of the addictive qualities to try to get them off heroin. And the pleasure that they get from the methadone is really not something you want to give them for its own sake, really, but as a way of trying to overcome the addiction. So there are things like that where you might say the pleasure is really primarily a tool in order to improve your life by making you healthier or getting you off heroin or whatever it happens to be. That would make you healthier, by the way. But okay, are there other candidates for things that are always sought for their own sake? Yeah?
Healthy food that you genuinely enjoy.
Healthy food
Yeah, and enjoy.
that you enjoy. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's healthy food that you enjoy is surely not always sought for its own sake. I mean, sometimes it might be sought just for the health benefits. Maybe you like kale. But if you do, well then, you know, when you eat the kale, presumably you're eating it partly because you enjoy it, but partly also because of the health benefits of doing it. So actually that would put it in that middle column if you're doing both. Now, of course we might say, but look, it's always sought for its own sake as well because you enjoy it so much. Yeah, but notice Aristotle says it's always sought for its own sake and never for the sake of something else. So something you really enjoy might be always sought in part for its own sake. So it's always over in that purple circle somewhere. But if it could be used, if part of the motivation could be instrumental, could be, you know, because it gets you something else, then it wouldn't count as, it wouldn't fulfill that other part of never desired for the sake of something else. Yeah? Natural body functions? Let's go no further with that. No, I mean, certain things, well, gosh, I'll try to take something that's not disgusting. Like breathing. Is breathing designed for its own sake? Not really, right? I mean, it's like, what are you planning to do today? Oh, I'm breathing, man. Well, yeah, so ordinarily I think not. However, I mean, in a sense, if you follow that line of reasoning far enough, I think you get led back to life. And the thought that life is that final value. Well, yes?
Happiness?
Ah, happiness. What about that? Say, why are you taking this class? Maybe you're taking this class because you want to get a degree. Why do you want to get a degree? Well, because you'd like to get a good job as a result of that. Why do you want a good job? Well, you'll enjoy it, number one. You might value it for its own sake, and it will bring you money. And why do you care about money? Well, because that will buy you various goods. Some of those you might desire for their own sakes, some for the sake of something else. But ultimately, you might want to say, look, because I want to be happy. I want to lead a happy life. And so happiness is this sort of thing. I always desire happiness for its own sake, and never for the sake of something else. Somebody says, well, I'm doing it because it makes me happy. And they say, why do you want to be happy? It'd be weird to say, well, you know, happy people are more friendly. Or happy people get better jobs. I mean, it might be true, because who wants to hire a sad sack? But on the other hand, it's a weird reason to want to be happy. And so you might say, yeah, happiness is a pretty good candidate. In fact, that is Aristotle's candidate. He says, one thing is always desired for its own sake, and never for the sake of something else. And by the way, in that image, he's acting there as tutor to Alexander. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered the world. So that's what changed by now. But anyway, yeah, he says one thing is always desired for its own sake and never for the sake of something else, namely happiness. In the end, we always want to be happy, and not for anything else, but just because happiness is desirable in and of itself. Question over here, yeah. Good question. What's the difference between pleasure and happiness? There are a number of things in that middle area of the circle. Virtue, he would say, pleasure, self-esteem, the honor of your peers, being thought well of by other people. There are a variety of things like that, he says, that are going to be components of happiness. They are not happiness themselves, but they are parts. So, a good way to ask about this is to say, look, actually, yeah, that's where he's just saying this. What is happiness? His term for it is eudaimonia in the Greek, and that could be translated as living well, or as flourishing, thriving. In fact, I have a friend who's an Aristotelian, and when he sees me, he says, Daniel, are you flourishing? And he means something much broader than, are you feeling pleasure right now? Okay? The answer to that is obviously yes, because I'm seeing my old friend. But no, it's not something that is really transitory. Pleasure is something that comes and goes. You can sort of have somebody pat you on the head and say, good job, and you feel that pleasure. But then when they stop and you go along, it's like, yeah, new experiences replace that. Happiness isn't that transitory. Okay, pleasure is something that can change moment to moment. But happiness ordinarily isn't usually like that. Yeah?
But is it happiness really attainable, or is it just an idea of happiness? Can you ever, are you always wanting more? Are you always, when you reach your level of happiness, looking for something else that will give you happiness? Is the never-ending chase?
All right, good question. Can you ever actually attain happiness? Aristotle says there's a puzzle about this. Because actually, if we start thinking about a life well lived, he says we really have to judge that, not on the basis of moment to moment, but on the basis of an entire life. Imagine yourself at the end of your life, looking back on your life, saying, have I lived well? Have I been happy in that sense? Have I thrived? Have I flourished? And he says, look, in a sense, no matter how you think you're doing at a given time, are you flourishing right now? And his image of this is a plant growing. Think of a plant. Is the plant doing well? That can change. Like right now, no, it needs water. But then it gets rain, so now the plant is happy. Happy in that sense of flourishing. It's thriving right now. But he says, if we look back and say, has a person lived well? Is the plant flourishing and thriving? We really have to think about something broader. And so I think he would say, you're absolutely right, that happiness isn't to be conceived as this state where it's just like, now I'm happy. There was a video game I used to play in the early days of video games, where you went through and you tried to get to this central thing, despite snakes and dragons and mice that, I guess they were rats, but they looked like little mice that nipped at your feet and so on. And finally, if you got there, there was this thing that looked like a tomb appeared, and this wonderful chord just went, boom. It was kind of like, right? But I think what you're pointing out is, look, happiness is nothing like that. It's not like you're going along and you sort of imagine it is, right? You imagine, I'll graduate, and at the moment I graduate, you're gonna be like, boom. I'm just there, right? Like, I'm the sage who has reached enlightenment, and now I can just go. And the rest of my life will just be. And it's not like that at all. And in fact, you might think, part of living well is constantly trying to improve yourself, constantly trying to do a better job, constantly trying to improve the world, and so on. And so it's not to be conceived of as that kind of state at all. In fact, he worries even a lifetime isn't really long enough to judge it, because as a person lives well, it might depend on what happens after they're dead. And then he says, but it seems really weird to say we don't know whether somebody's happy until they're dead, and then long after. But there are things that can happen after you're dead that would actually make us look back on your life and change our judgment about whether it was a life well lived. So there's a puzzle here. And as happens with many puzzles in Greek philosophy, it's framed, and then he just says, well, let's get on to other things. So he never really gives us an answer to this. Much later, Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, has your kind of worry and says, wait a minute. And calls for the revaluation of values, thinks that part of life is constantly subjecting your own values to re-examination. And he says, look, all ends devalue themselves. You might think, I really want to graduate, I'll be so happy. Then you graduate and you realize, oh, good, now I'm a graduate. Not that that's not a good thing, but it's like, there's still life. It's not like now it's just, I just coast, right? Or the same thing happens actually when professors try to get tenure. You get tenure, or you make partnership with a law firm, or whatever it is. And you think, and then you realize, oh, all that means is I'm not fired. Great, awesome. But anyway, his point is, as soon as you achieve these milestones, you realize, oh, well, all right, you take that for granted and move on. Go ahead.
Is that the reason why athletes tend to get like these depressions and suicide after doing it, like
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It can be a very hard thing to deal with. There are people who are amazingly successful, and after that, go into a depression. Almost everybody I know, actually, who's gotten tenure, finds the next year actually pretty rough. And why? Because all of a sudden, you've been living up to this external standard, and you thought once you met it, it was going to be all bliss and glorious. And then you find out, no, it's just more of the same, actually. Except that now, instead of having to meet this standard somebody else sets, you've got to set your own standard for what you want to accomplish. And then it's like, ooh, okay, that's hard. That's a harder question. If I just have to do what you tell me to do, that's something I can do. But now I have to decide, what do I really want to accomplish? What do I really want to do? And that's more complicated. And so I think a lot of people do that. You're there, you work for years to try to win the gold medal, finally you win the gold medal, and now what do you do with your life? What's your goal now? And that can be, it really makes you rethink your life and what you value and what you're going to take as intrinsically valuable. And so it can be a hard thing for people to do. Yeah?
So by that standard, does that mean that in order to be happy, we have to be in constant pursuit of the higher desires?
Does it mean we constantly have to be in pursuit of things? I don't want to say that either. Some philosophers would say that, but it seems to me, think of a retired person who worked long and hard on a job and they retired. And now you say, what do you do? Well, I just go sailing on the lake. Or my wife's retired and basically she just acts as cat furniture. People say, what are you doing? And I say, she's cat furniture. And you think, what? She's now making cat furniture? No, she is cat furniture. It just sits there and cats come and sit on her lap. That's more or less a day. And, well, I better edit that part out before I put it on YouTube. But anyway, look, that's okay. I mean, I'm not saying at every point you have to be striving for something new. That's a pretty demanding conception of life, too. So Aristotle really says, look, in a way, it's up to you. Think about the kinds of things. Let me ask you this question. Imagine yourself really at the end of your life. How would you describe a life well lived? What would you say? I want this to be true of me. I will count my life well lived if it has these sorts of characteristics. What are things you would want to be basic parts of a life well lived? I mean, it might be constantly striving for something new, but it might be, I want time to relax and not be striving for anything. But what are some other things that you care about, you value? Yeah.
Enjoying the things that you actually had instead of always being in pursuit of others.
Okay, good. Enjoying what you actually have instead of always being in pursuit of other things or more things, that type of thing. Yeah.
Having the respect of a lot of people after your death.
Having the respect of a lot of people after your death. Yes, that might be true. You want a lot of people to come to your funeral and say, what a great guy. You know, if you think a life well lived would be one where at the end they just say, oh, you know, let's rip his body to shreds and scatter the ashes where no one will find them and wipe all names from the record books and so on. Yeah, that's not a good thing. Anyway, other things you would want to be true of your life. Gosh, you know, it's very interesting. When I teach older students, and I don't mean necessarily elderly, but just sort of 30s, 40s and stuff, professionals, they have so many things they immediately say. It's a different set of things from the things you tend to say, which is interesting. Yeah?
I was actually wondering if you could possibly say that Aristotle really meant contentment, and like that might be the step above happiness, because happiness is fleeting and it's like a mental state. So contentment is your ultimate final good.
What about contentment, she's asking? Is that either a way of understanding what he means by happiness, or could we say, maybe that's a better candidate? What you really desire is contentment. Well, if we think about a life well lived, it's a life you might think, yeah, I don't know, there are different ideas that are very close here. For example, fulfillment. That's something that's close to contentment, close to what he means by happiness, not exactly the same thing. Or what about, well, a common Eastern answer is enlightenment. And that is supposed to bring along with it a sense of fulfillment, a sense of contentment, but it's something broader than that and thought to be underlying those. So there are a variety of other things. A lot of religious thinkers have thought the highest possible thing I can strive for would be some kind of communion with God. And so that's what really ought to go there. So there are other candidates like that, some very close to what he means by happiness and some a little further away, but that are in that kind of ballpark. And it would be a long, anyway, it'd be a long conversation to try to sort out what those differences are. But I think you're right to say contentment or fulfillment or enlightenment or whatever could be candidates for what that really in the end comes to. Now I'm going to move on here a little bit since I've been talking a long time about this, because we need to think about his conception of virtue. What is it to live well? Well, he says, look, let's think about some simple cases. And Aristotle often does this, by the way. His strategy is to say, let's take some well-understood cases and use those as models to think about the hard cases. So what is it to be a good human being and to lead a good human life? Well, think about what it is to be a good knife. A good knife cuts well. What is it to be a good eye? it sees well. A good teacher teaches well. Now in each case, you might think, the thing has a function. And for it to be good is for it to fulfill that function well. So what is a good person? One who fulfills his or her function well. But what is the function of a person? Yeah?
That's what I was going to say, is then begs the question, what is the function of life, or what is the meaning of life?
Good. Yeah, exactly. What is the function of a human being? What are we here for? What is our purpose? What are we for? Now, some answers to that we're going to say, wow, what a dumb question. There's nothing in particular we're here for. The existentialists have that answer. What are you here for? It's up to you. There's no purpose that we're given. Religious thinkers might say we're here to glorify God, or we're here for this or that other purpose. Aristotle's answer is different. He says, what are we for? Well, he says, let's think about knives again. What is it about knives that makes their function cutting? There's some quality they have that's tied to that function. They're sharp. What about eyes? It's their ability to see that gives them the function of seeing. What about teachers? It's our ability to teach. And so now the question is, what is distinctive? What is special about human beings? How are we different from the animals? How are we different from plants? He said, well, how am I different from a rock? Well, in all sorts of ways, right? I move around, for example. That's how I'm different from plants, too. What about other animals? How am I different from a raccoon or a gorilla? Yeah?
We're rational.
Good, we are rational. He says there are lots of things you can say, but in the end it all comes down to this. We are rational beings. We are capable of rational activities. So what is it that's special about people? There are many things that are special about us, but in the end what it all comes down to, in his opinion, is we are capable of acting according to rational plans. It's not enough to say we're rational, though that's a huge part of the answer. After all, animals may be able to think to some degree. They may even be able to solve problems. The monkey given some boxes and so on, and a banana hanging at the top of the cage can figure out how to get up there. But we are capable of planning, of complex action, of acting according to rational plans in a way that no animal is. We can build universities. We can build hospitals. We can build automobiles. There's no equivalent in the world of monkeys or raccoons. They don't do those kinds of things because they take extensive planning. And so to act according to rational plans, he says, is really what is essential to us. Well, if that's right, and that involves some kind of rational principle, then he says, virtue, the human good, is going to turn out to be doing that well, okay? Excellence in rational activity. So human good turns out to be an activity of soul in accordance with virtue. Virtue, in the Greek arete, is his term for excellence. So our function is rational activity. A good person succeeds at rational activity. We do that well. We excel at rational activity. Now what's required to excel at rational activity? Well, two kinds of excellence, really. Excellence in the rationality part, and his name for that is intellectual virtue, but also excellence in the activity part. That's moral virtue. So we have to excel in both of those ways. And they're different kinds of excellence. One involves knowing what to do, that's the intellectual virtue part, but one involves being able to put that into action. And that is the moral virtue. So if our goal is to excel at rational activity, then we better excel at rationality and excel at putting those rational plans into action. Now, he says those are actually quite different. There are two kinds of virtue going along with those two components, but we get them in different ways. Intellectual virtue, he says, can be taught. I can teach you how to solve certain kinds of problems. I can teach you to figure out what to do in certain kinds of situations. But he says moral virtue can't be taught. It isn't just knowing, it involves doing. And so you can teach somebody all you want about what is ethics, what is right, what's wrong, what are good principles to make decisions by, what kind of life to lead. But in the end, it's up to them to do it. And just knowing all that stuff is not going to be enough to make them a good person. So study, philosophy by itself can't make people good. It can supply them with certain intellectual virtues to help them think about problems, help them discover how to live, but it can't make them do it. So, that means it is possible for us to be weak of will. In other words, it is possible to have the required intellectual virtue without the actual moral virtue. I may know what to do, but not do it. And so people have talked about this concept, weakness of will, in a variety of ways. You might define it as giving in to temptation, or as knowing the better and doing the worse, or as knowing what you ought to do and not doing it, or as doing something you don't think is right. All of those things are possible, he says, and they involve this division between intellectual virtue and moral virtue. You might know what to do, but not do it. Later we're going to see some views that deny that this is even possible. But he says, of course it's possible. I can know intellectually what to do, but I cannot actually have the ability to do it. And why not? I'm going to skip some of this because we'll come back to this. But in the end, it really comes down to how do I develop moral virtues? How do I develop willpower? The answer is by doing good things. He says, how do you learn to play the piano? Do you read a book on piano playing and you say, oh yeah, no, I don't know how to do it? Or tennis. Can you think, yeah, I'd like to take up tennis. I'll just read a book about it. No, you learn to play the piano by playing the piano. You learn to play tennis by playing tennis. So similarly, you learn to be good by doing good things. It requires a kind of training, the formation of habits. And so, in the end, he says, you become a person of practical wisdom. You know what to do, and you end up being able to put it into practice. Next week, we'll consider further figures in the empiricist tradition.